The water was wrong that day. Too fast, too angry, too alive with something that didn't belong in the natural order of things. Jack Thornwood could feel it in his bones before he even saw the river. That prickling sensation a man gets when the world is about to show him something he can't unsee. It was late autumn in 1883, and the Arizona Territory stretched out before him like a promise that had forgotten how to keep itself. Jack had been riding for 3 days straight, his horse, a dappled mare he called Dust, moving with the tired resignation of a creature that knew her rider had nowhere particular to go and no reason to hurry getting there. He was a drifter, a man whose past had burned away in the fires of choices he couldn't take back. 28 years old and already carrying the weight of 40. His hands were calloused from ranch work, his face weathered by sun and regret, and his eyes, those pale blue eyes, held the kind of emptiness that comes from losing something you can never name. The canyon walls rose up on either side of him, like cathedral stones, ancient and indifferent. The river below churned with snowmelt from mountains he couldn't see, swollen beyond its banks, furious with the kind of power that turns familiar landmarks into killing grounds. The sound of it, that relentless roar, filled the air so completely that Jack almost didn't hear the other sound. Almost. But he did hear it. A cry, sharp and desperate, human and drowning. For just a moment, and he would remember this moment for the rest of his life, Jack Thornwood hesitated, his survival instinct, honed by years of learning that heroism usually just gets you killed, screamed at him to keep riding. Whatever was happening down there in that furious water, it wasn't his problem. He had no debts to pay to strangers, no obligations to ghosts he hadn't met yet. But then he heard it again, and this time he could tell it was a woman's voice. Jack swung down from Dust before his mind could catch up with his body, his boots hitting the rocky ground with a certainty that bypassed thought entirely. He moved toward the river's edge, his eyes scanning the churning chaos for... There, a dark shape tumbling in the white water, appearing and disappearing like a terrible magic trick, arms flailing against the current with weakening desperation. The woman, if that's what it was, hard to tell in all that foam and fury, was being pulled downstream toward a section where the river narrowed between two massive boulders. In maybe 30 seconds, she'd be crushed against those rocks or pulled under for good. The math was simple and absolutely unforgiving. Jack didn't think. Thinking would have stopped him. He kicked off his boots, shrugged out of his coat, and felt his fingers working at his gun belt with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd dressed and undressed for survival more times than he could count. The water would be freezing. Snowmelt always was. The current would fight him with the strength of 10 horses. His chances of saving whoever this was, maybe 1 in 5. His chances of dying trying, much, much higher. He dove in anyway. The cold hit him like a physical blow, like being punched in the chest by winter itself. The air exploded from his lungs in a gasp he couldn't control, and for a terrifying second, Jack thought he'd made a catastrophic mistake. The current grabbed him immediately, pulling him downstream with such force that he understood, truly understood, how powerless a man is against water that has decided to kill. But Jack had grown up swimming in rivers. Back when he still had a home, back when he still had a family, back before everything turned to ash and absence. His body remembered what his mind wanted to forget. He angled himself across the current, not fighting it directly, that was suicide, but using its power to push him toward where he'd seen the woman go under. His lungs were already burning, his muscles already screaming from the cold that was stealing his strength with every passing second. He couldn't see her anymore. The water was too wild, too full of mud and debris, tree branches and rocks tumbling past him like the world was ending and taking everything with it. Then his hand hit something solid, not a rock, softer than that, cloth, skin. He grabbed, his fingers closing around an arm, and pulled with everything he had left. The current wanted to rip her away from him, wanted to complete what it had started, but Jack held on with the grip of a man who had already decided he wasn't going to fail at this, even if it was the last thing he ever succeeded at. Her face broke the surface, just for a moment, and Jack caught a glimpse of dark eyes, wide with terror and fading consciousness, skin the color of deep copper, long black hair plastered across features that were drowning in plain sight. Then the current took them both under again, tumbling them like dice in the hand of a god that didn't care about the outcome. Jack's knee cracked against a submerged rock, white-hot pain that he filed away to deal with later if there was a later, and he used the impact to push himself and the woman toward the shallower water near the bank. His free arm clawed at anything solid, roots, rocks, anything to arrest their downstream rush toward those killing boulders. His hand found a root, thick and ancient and strong, jutting from the bank like it had been waiting for exactly this moment. He grabbed it, feeling the bark tear his palm, feeling his shoulder joint scream as the current tried to rip his arm from its socket. The woman's weight pulled at him dead weight now, unconscious or worse, and Jack realized he was holding two lives by a thread of wood and will. He pulled inch by impossible inch, his muscles doing things they shouldn't be able to do, fueled by adrenaline and that strange grace that sometimes descends on people in the moment they decide to be more than they are. The bank was so close, just 3 feet away, but it might as well have been 3 miles. His grip on the root was slipping, his hand too torn and wet to hold much longer. Then his foot found bottom. Mud. But solid mud. Purchase. Leverage. Jack planted his feet, braced against the current, and hauled the woman up with a strength he didn't know he possessed. They broke free of the water's grip together, Jack dragging her up the muddy bank until they were clear of the water's reach, until they were on solid ground that didn't want to kill them. He collapsed beside her, his chest heaving, his body shaking so hard from the cold that he couldn't tell if he was having a seizure or just learning what it meant to be alive. For a long moment, he just lay there, staring at the sky, thinking about nothing except the miracle of air entering and leaving his lungs. Then he remembered the woman. Jack rolled onto his side, his movements clumsy and urgent, and looked at her for the first time in stillness. She wasn't breathing. Her lips were blue, her face pale beneath the copper of her skin, her body limp in a way that spoke of absence. He'd pulled a corpse from the river, he'd risked everything for nothing. No. Jack's hands moved to her chest, pressing down in the rhythm he'd seen a camp doctor demonstrate years ago. 1, 2, 3, 4, steady and firm, trying to force her lungs to remember their purpose. Water trickled from her mouth. He tilted her head, checked that her airway was clear, and pressed again. 1, 2, 3, 4. Come on, come on. Nothing. He bent close to her face, breathed air into her lungs once, twice, tasting river water and something else, something like sage and smoke. Then back to the compressions. 1, 2, 3, 4. His arms were shaking, his strength almost gone, but he kept going because stopping meant accepting failure, and he'd already decided that wasn't an option today. Then she coughed. Water erupted from her mouth in a choking flood, her body convulsing as her lungs fought to expel the river that had tried to claim her. Jack rolled her onto her side, supporting her as she vomited water and gasped for air in great, shuddering breaths that were the most beautiful sounds he'd ever heard. She lived. Her eyes opened, dark brown, almost black, fierce even in their confusion, and locked onto his face. For a moment they just stared at each other. Two strangers on the bank of a killing river, connected by the simple and profound fact that one of them had refused to let the other die. Then her eyes rolled back, and she went limp again. Not dead, but unconscious, her body surrendering to the trauma and cold. Jack gathered her in his arms. She was tall, he realized, nearly as tall as him, and built with the lean muscle of someone who lived hard and physical, and looked around with the sudden awareness that he had no idea what to do next. He was soaked, freezing, miles from anywhere, with an unconscious woman who would die of exposure in minutes if he didn't get her warm. His horse was somewhere upstream. He could hear dust nickering nervously, and the sun was already starting its descent toward the horizon. In a few hours, the temperature would drop below freezing. Jack Thornwood had jumped into a river to save a stranger's life, and now he realized that the hard part was just beginning. Survival has its own logic, a cold, calculating mathematics that strips away everything except what matters in the immediate next moment. Jack's brain shifted into that mode as he carried the woman up the rocky slope, away from the river's reach, his body moving on instinct while his mind raced through options. Fire, shelter, warmth, those were the priorities in that exact order. Everything else was luxury. He found his horse 100 yards upstream, still waiting with the patient loyalty of animals who have learned to trust their humans, even when those humans do inexplicably dangerous things. Dust regarded him with what Jack could have sworn was reproach, as if to say, "Really, this is what we're doing now? This is what?" Jack laid the woman down gently on a patch of grass, then worked quickly to strip the bedroll and supplies from Dust's back. His hands were shaking, whether from cold or adrenaline or both he couldn't tell, but they still remembered how to work. He wrapped the woman in his only dry blanket, then looked around with the practiced eye of someone who'd made camp in worse places. There, about 50 yards to the west, an overhang of rock that created a shallow cave. Not perfect, but it would block the wind and reflect heat from a fire. Good enough. It would have to be. He carried the woman to the shelter, laid her down on the driest patch of ground he could find, then turned his attention to the desperate business of making fire. His matches were in his saddlebag, which was soaked. Of course they were. Nothing about this day was going to be easy. But Jack had been making fires since he was 8 years old, and he'd learned from an old rancher, who'd learned from a mountain man, who'd probably learned from God himself. You don't need matches if you have patience, friction, and a deep, stubborn refusal to freeze to death. He found dry tinder under the rock overhang, dead grass, and shredded bark that had been protected from the weather. He gathered dry sticks and branches, building a small nest of kindling with hands that barely felt like they belonged to him anymore. Then he took his knife and a piece of flat wood and began the tedious, arm-aching work of creating fire through friction. Spin, 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 the knife's spine grinding against the wood, creating friction, generating heat, producing tiny wisps of smoke that were the most precious things in the world right now. His shoulders burned, his cold muscles protesting, but he kept going because stopping meant death for both of them. A spark, a tiny miraculous spark that fell into the tinder nest like a fallen star. Jack bent low, cupping his hands around it, breathing on it with the gentleness of prayer, and the tinder caught. A small flame flickered to life, grew stronger, spread to the kindling, and suddenly he had fire. Actual, real, life-saving fire. He fed it carefully, building it up until he had a respectable blaze going, and then he finally let himself collapse beside it, his body shaking so hard that his teeth were chattering like castanets. He'd done it. They were going to survive the night. Probably. He turned his attention to the woman, and in the flickering firelight, he finally got his first real look at her. She was Apache. That much was clear from her features. Her clothing, the beadwork on her buckskin dress that was traditional in a way that spoke of importance. She was young, maybe 25, but carried herself even in unconsciousness with a kind of dignity that made Jack think of leaders, of people who are born knowing they're meant for something more than ordinary life. Her face was striking, high cheekbones, strong jaw, a scar that ran along her left temple that looked like it came from a blade or a bad fall. Her hair, now drying in the firelight, was black, not just dark, but truly black, like obsidian, like midnight with no moon, and she was tall. He hadn't been imagining that. At least 5'10", with broad shoulders and arms that showed muscle earned through use, not decoration. She was also still dangerously cold. Jack knew what he had to do, and he didn't let himself think about the awkwardness of it. Modesty was a luxury for people who weren't dying of hypothermia. He worked quickly and clinically, removing her wet buckskin dress and leggings, wrapping her in his dry blanket and his spare shirt, positioning her close to the fire but not too close. Then he stripped off his own soaked clothes, wrung them out, and hung them near the fire to dry. He sat beside her, wearing only his long underwear, feeding the fire and watching her breathe. Her chest rose and fell steadily now. That was good. Her color was returning, the blue tinge fading from her lips. She would wake up. She had to wake up. The night descended around them like a curtain falling, and Jack found himself wondering who she was. What was an Apache woman doing alone by that river? The tribes were being pushed onto reservations. The wars were mostly over, at least the official ones. But tensions were still high, and a woman traveling alone in this country was asking for trouble from multiple directions. Unless she wasn't alone. The thought hit Jack like a fist. If she wasn't alone, if she had people, they would be looking for her. And if they found her here, in a cave with a white cowboy, both of them mostly naked, no amount of explaining would save him from a very justifiable death. He should leave. The smart play was to leave her here, warm and alive with the fire still going, and ride away before dawn. She'd recover, find her way back to her people, and he'd be just another nameless white man who'd pass through her story without consequence. But Jack couldn't move. Something, call it conscience, call it curiosity, call it the strange gravity that pulls certain people into each other's orbits, kept him there, feeding the fire, watching over this stranger whose life was now tangled up with his own in ways he didn't yet understand. The hours passed slowly, the fire crackling, the night sounds of the Arizona wilderness creating a symphony of howls and rustles and distant screams. An owl called from somewhere close by. Coyotes argued in the distance. The river continued its relentless roar, a reminder of what had almost been. And then, somewhere around midnight, she opened her eyes. Her hand moved first, fast, deadly fast, reaching for something that wasn't there. A weapon, Jack realized. She was reaching for a weapon. Then her eyes focused on him, on the fire, on her state of undress, and Jack saw her mind working through the situation with impressive speed. He raised his hands slowly, palms out, universal language for, "I mean no harm." He didn't speak, didn't know if she spoke English, and didn't want his voice to be the thing that startled her into violence. He just sat there, hands up, letting her assess the situation. She stared at him for a long moment, and then slowly, deliberately, she nodded. Just once. It wasn't gratitude, not yet, but it was acknowledgement. She understood that he'd saved her, that they were even, for now. Then she closed her eyes again and slept. But this time it was real sleep, healing sleep, not the unconsciousness of someone circling death. Jack lowered his hands, added more wood to the fire, and settled in to watch the rest of the night pass. He didn't know her name, didn't know where she'd come from or why she'd been in that river, didn't know if saving her would bring him trouble or peace or something in between. But he knew, with the certainty that comes from the gut rather than the brain, that this night had changed something fundamental in his life, that the current of the river had swept him into a story much larger than himself. And there was no going back to who he'd been before he'd heard that cry. Dawn came slowly, reluctant, as if even the sun wasn't sure what to make of the scene in that small cave. Jack had dozed fitfully through the last hours of darkness, his back against the rock wall, his hand never far from his knife. Not because he feared the woman, but because he feared what might come looking for her. When full light finally penetrated their shelter, she was already awake, sitting up with her back straight, the blanket wrapped around her shoulders like a cape, her dark eyes watching him with an intensity that was almost uncomfortable. Jack met her gaze. and waited. In his experience, it was usually better to let the other person speak first, especially when that person was from a culture you didn't fully understand and probably had very good reasons to distrust you. She spoke, her voice rough from the river water but clear and strong. The words were Apache, flowing and rhythmic, with consonants that clicked in ways English never could. Jack shook his head, spreading his hands in a gesture of incomprehension. She studied him for a moment, then switched languages. "You pulled me from the water." Not a question, a statement. Her English was accented but precise, each word chosen carefully. "Yes," Jack said, "you were drowning." "I know." She touched her throat, wincing slightly. "I remember falling, the current, the cold, then nothing, then you." Jack nodded, unsure what else to say. Conversation had never been his strength, and this particular conversation felt like walking through a field where every step might trigger something explosive. "I am Tahira," she said, "daughter of Niol, war chief of the Chiricahua band. You have saved the life of someone who matters to her people, and that means you have created a debt that cannot be ignored." The way she said it, matters, wasn't arrogance. It was simple fact, stated with the certainty of someone who'd grown up knowing their place in a hierarchy and the responsibilities that came with it. "I'm Jack Thornwood," he replied, "and I don't need any debt. You don't owe me anything. I heard someone drowning. I acted. That's all." Tahira's expression shifted, something that might have been amusement or pity or both. "That is not how my people see the world, Jack Thornwood. Among the Apache, a life saved creates a bond. You held my spirit when it was trying to leave this world, and you pulled it back. That is not a small thing. That is sacred." The word hung in the air between them. Sacred. Jack had never thought of himself as particularly religious, but he understood the weight of sacred things. You didn't dismiss them just because they made you uncomfortable. "What does that mean?" he asked. "This bond? It means," Tahira said slowly, "that you are now connected to me, and through me to my people. It means that when I return to my band and tell them what you have done, they will honor you. It means that you have made friends in a time and place where friends are rare and precious. It means—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "It means your life just became more complicated." Jack almost laughed at that, because if there was one thing he'd been trying to do for the past 5 years, it was keep his life simple. No attachments, no obligations, no debts owed or owing. Just drifting from place to place, working when he needed money, moving on when things got complicated. And now this. "What were you doing in the river?" he asked, changing the subject because he didn't know how to respond to the idea of being bonded to an entire Apache band. Tahira's face darkened. "Running. We were camped 3 miles upstream, my father and our people. We've been moving through this territory carefully, trying to avoid the soldiers who want to force us onto the reservation. Yesterday, scouts spotted a cavalry patrol heading our direction. We packed everything quickly, started moving at night. I was crossing the river to retrieve supplies we'd cached on the far side, and I slipped. The rocks were wet. The current was stronger than I expected." She touched her temple, where that old scar was. "I hit my head on a rock. After that, I only remember the water and trying to breathe, and then nothing." "Your people," Jack said. "They're looking for you." "Yes." Tahira's voice was flat, certain. "My father will have sent warriors downstream as soon as they realized I was gone. They will find us today, probably within hours." "And they'll find you with me," Jack said. "A white man, in a cave, with your clothes drying by the fire." "Yes, they're going to kill me." Tahira tilted her head, considering. "Probably not. My father is not a fool, and neither are his warriors. They will see the signs. The way you pulled me from the water, the fire you built, the care you took to keep me alive, they will understand what happened." "Probably not," Jack repeated. "You said probably not." "Nothing in this life is certain, Jack Thornwood. The hint of amusement was back in her voice. "But if they do try to kill you, I will stop them. A life debt works both ways. I owe you my protection as much as you owe me. Whatever you owe me." Jack wasn't entirely comforted by this, but he supposed it was better than nothing. They spent the next hour in careful preparation. Tahira dressing in her now dry clothes, Jack packing up his meagre camp, both of them speaking little but working with the efficiency of people who understood that danger was coming and preparation was the only shield they had. When they were done, Tahira stood at the mouth of the cave, looking down at the river that had nearly claimed her. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for not riding away, for not leaving me to die, for seeing a person in the water, not just an Apache, not just an enemy." "You were never my enemy," Jack said. "I don't have enemies anymore. I gave that up." "Everyone has enemies," Tahira replied, "even those who wish they didn't. You will learn this." And then, before Jack could respond, she went very still, her head tilted, her whole body alert in the way of predators who have sensed something in their territory. "They're coming," she said. "My people. I can hear them." Jack strained his ears, but heard nothing except the river and the wind. "How can you—" "Listen," she interrupted. "Not with your ears, with everything else." He tried, and maybe it was suggestion, or maybe it was something real, but he thought he could feel it, a presence in the landscape, a human presence, multiple human presences, moving through the wilderness with purpose. "Stay calm," Tahira said. "Let me speak first. Do not reach for your weapons. Do not make yourself look dangerous." "I wasn't planning on it," Jack muttered. "And Jack Thornwood?" "Yeah? Try to look harmless, grateful, maybe a little stupid." "Gee, thanks." But he understood what she meant. He was about to meet a group of Apache warriors who were probably terrified for their chief's daughter, probably furious that she'd been missing all night, and probably predisposed to blame the first white man they found. His best bet was to seem as non-threatening as possible. So when the first warrior appeared at the edge of the clearing, tall, painted for war, carrying a rifle that looked well used, Jack did exactly what Tahira had told him to do. He stood very still, kept his hands visible and empty, and tried his best to look like someone who desperately wanted to live. There were 6 of them, 6 Apache warriors who materialized from the landscape like they'd been formed from rock and shadow. They moved with a silence that made Jack's skin prickle, the kind of silence that comes from lifetimes of hunting and being hunted, where a single snapped twig could mean the difference between eating and starving, between living and dying. The first warrior, the one who'd appeared at the clearing's edge, had paint across his face in patterns Jack didn't understand, red and black, stark against copper skin, making him look like something from a nightmare or a vision. His eyes went immediately to Tahira, scanning her for injury with the intensity of someone checking a loved one after a battle. Then those eyes shifted to Jack, and everything went very cold, very fast. Tahira stepped forward, placing herself slightly between Jack and the warriors. She spoke in rapid Apache, her voice carrying authority despite the roughness left by river water. The warrior responded, his tone sharp with questions Jack couldn't understand but could feel: accusation, confusion, protective fury. The conversation went back and forth. Tahira explaining, the warrior demanding, other warriors circling around to create a loose perimeter that Jack recognized as a kill formation. They were positioned so that no matter which way he ran, at least 2 of them would have a clear shot. Professional, efficient, terrifying. One of the younger warriors, barely more than a boy, maybe 17, was staring at Jack with undisguised hatred. His hand kept moving to the knife at his belt, fingers flexing, wanting. Jack kept his eyes forward, not making eye contact, trying to communicate not a threat with every fiber of his being. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, Tahira turned to Jack. "This is Kale," she said, gesturing to the lead warrior. "He is my father's most trusted man, and he has been looking for me since yesterday evening. I have told him what happened, how you saved me, how you built the fire and kept me alive through the night." "And," Jack asked, "does he believe you?" "He believes me," Tahira said, "but belief and trust are different things. He wants to bring you to our camp, to present you to my father. You will tell your story again, and Niol will decide what your reward will be." Reward. The word should have been comforting, but something about the way Tahira said it made Jack nervous. What if I don't want a reward? What if I just want to ride on? Kayleigh spoke sharp, guttural sounds that needed no translation. Tahira's expression tightened. "That is not an option. You have involved yourself in Apache business, Jack Thornwood. You cannot simply walk away now. My people do not work that way." "So I'm a prisoner," Jack said flatly. "You are a guest," Tahira corrected. "There is a difference. But yes, you do not have a choice in this. You will come with us, and you will meet my father, and together we will determine what your place is in this story." Jack looked at the 6 warriors surrounding him, at their weapons, at the absolute certainty in their postures that they would kill him if he tried to run. And he realized that argument was pointless. He was going to the Apache camp, whether he wanted to or not. "Fine," he said. "Let's go meet your father. Let's." The journey took most of the day, moving through terrain that seemed impossible to navigate, but that the Apache traversed like they'd been born to it. Jack rode dust, surrounded by the warriors, who maintained a loose formation that was somehow both casual and utterly attentive. They were watching him every second, even when they seemed to be looking elsewhere. Tahira rode beside him for part of the journey, on a horse that Kayleigh had brought for her. She didn't speak much, but her presence felt protective, like a shield between Jack and the suspicion of her people. "Tell me about your father," Jack said during a rare moment when they were slightly separated from the others. "What kind of man is he?" Tahira considered the question. "Niol is hard. He has had to be. He has watched our people be pushed and pushed and pushed, off our lands, away from our sacred places, onto reservations where the government promises food and delivers starvation. He has buried 3 wives, 2 sons, and a daughter. He has fought in more battles than he can count, and he has lost more of those battles than he has won." "Sounds like a man who doesn't like white people very much," Jack observed. "He doesn't," Tahira agreed. "But he is also wise. He understands that hatred without discernment is just another kind of blindness. He judges people by their actions, not their skin. You saved his eldest daughter, his heir. That will matter to him. How much it matters." She shrugged. "We will see." "Your heir?" Jack asked. "You're going to be chief." "War chief," Tahira corrected, "like my father. It is unusual for a woman, but not forbidden. I proved myself in combat when I was 16, killed 2 Mexican soldiers who attacked our camp. Since then, my father has been training me. When he dies or can no longer lead, the band will choose. Probably me, maybe someone else. It depends on who I am when that time comes." Jack absorbed this information, trying to reconcile it with the woman he'd pulled from the river, and finding that it fit perfectly. There had been something in her eyes, even when she was half drowned. Something that spoke of command, of expectation, of power. "So I didn't just save any random person," Jack said. "I saved the next leader of your people." "Yes," Tahira said, "which is why this is so complicated, and why my father will take this very, very seriously." They rode in silence after that, through canyons that twisted like the intestines of the earth, across mesas where the wind howled with voices that sounded almost human, past rock formations that looked like they'd been carved by gods with a sense of humor or a grudge. And then, as the sun was starting its descent toward evening, they rounded a ridge, and Jack saw the Apache camp spread out in a hidden valley below. It was smaller than he'd expected, maybe 40 people total, their wiki-ups arranged in a loose circle that suggested both community and the ability to scatter quickly if needed. Smoke rose from several fires. Children were playing near the center of camp. Women were working on hides and baskets. Men were checking weapons and horses. It looked normal, domestic, human. Jack didn't know what he'd been expecting. Something more savage, maybe. Something that matched the stories white people told about wild Indians. But this was just a community. People living their lives, trying to survive in a world that was actively hostile to their existence. As they descended into the valley, people began to notice. The children stopped playing, the women looked up from their work, the men reached for weapons, and then saw Tahira alive and well, and the tension shifted from alarm to confusion to guarded relief. Kayleigh called out something in Apache, announcing their arrival, Jack guessed, and then, from the largest wiki-up at the center of camp, a man emerged. Niol! Even from a distance, Jack could feel the weight of him, not physical size, though he was tall and broad-shouldered, but presence, authority, the kind of gravity that makes everyone else in the vicinity unconsciously orient themselves toward him. He walked toward them with measured steps, his face unreadable, his eyes moving from Tahira to Jack and back again. When he reached them, he spoke to his daughter in Apache, low, intense, words that Jack couldn't understand but could feel. Questions, relief, perhaps anger. Tahira responded, her voice calm but respectful. She gestured to Jack several times. Explained. Defended, maybe. Finally, Niol turned his full attention to Jack, and Jack felt himself being assessed with a thoroughness that was almost physical. This was a man who'd spent decades making life-or-death decisions based on quick readings of character and threat. His eyes missed nothing. The way Jack sat his horse, the weapons he carried, the tension in his shoulders, the fear he was trying to hide. Then Niol spoke, in perfect, unaccented English. My daughter tells me you pulled her from the water, that you risked your life to save hers. Is this true? Jack met his gaze, didn't flinch away, but didn't challenge either. Yes, sir, I heard someone drowning. I went in after her. That's the truth of it. Why? The question was simple but loaded with complexity. Why would a white man save an Apache woman? What did he want? What was his angle? Because she was drowning, Jack said. I didn't think. I just acted. By the time I realized who she was, we were both in the water. Niol studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Dismount. You will eat with us. We will talk, and then I will decide what to do with you. It wasn't exactly a warm welcome, but it wasn't a death sentence either. Jack would take it. The campfire that evening was a ceremonial thing, not just for warmth or cooking, but for gathering. The entire band assembled in a loose circle around the flames, and Jack found himself seated across from Niol, with Tahira on her father's right hand and Kale on his left. The warriors who'd found them were positioned strategically around the circle, protection and containment in equal measure. Jack had been given food, venison and some kind of cornmeal cake that was better than anything he'd eaten in weeks, and he ate slowly, aware that every movement he made was being watched and interpreted. When everyone had eaten, Niol spoke, in Apache first, his voice carrying across the assembled people, telling them the story of what had happened. Jack caught Tahira's name, heard what might have been river and drowning, understood from context that Niol was explaining how his daughter had been saved. Then Niol switched to English, and his voice took on a different quality, formal, weighted. Jack Thornwood, you have done something that cannot be ignored or dismissed. In saving my daughter's life, you have created a bond, what we call Hiwidi, a sacred connection that ties your fate to ours. Do you understand this? Your daughter explained some of it, Jack said carefully, though I'm not sure I understand all the implications. The implications are these, Niol said. You are now under our protection. Any enemy of ours who harms you answers to the entire band. Any friend of ours must treat you as one of our own. And—" he paused, his eyes gleaming in the firelight. "You are bound to us in return. You cannot betray us without breaking something sacred. You cannot harm us without harming yourself spiritually." Jack absorbed this, trying to wrap his mind around the idea that one moment of instinct had tied him to an entire community. What if I don't want this bond? What if I just want to go back to my life? Murmurs ran through the assembled Apache, and Jack realized he'd said something offensive or foolish or both. Neol's expression hardened. "You don't understand. This is not something you want or don't want. It simply is. The bond was created the moment you pulled my daughter from the water. You can honor it or dishonor it, but you cannot unmake it." "I don't mean disrespect," Jack said quickly. I'm a drifter. I don't have a home, don't have people. I'm not used to being connected to anything." "Then perhaps," Tahira said quietly, "this is the universe telling you it's time to change that." Neol raised his hand, silencing the murmurs. "I have decided, Jack Thornwood, you will stay with us for one moon cycle, 30 days. You will live among us, learn our ways, prove that you are worthy of the trust my daughter has placed in you. At the end of that time, if you wish to leave, you may go with our blessing, but you will always be bound to us, and we to you. That is not negotiable." Jack wanted to argue, wanted to say that 30 days in an Apache camp was basically a death sentence if the army found them, wanted to point out that he had no skills that would be useful to these people, wanted to explain that he was terrible at staying in one place. But he looked at Tahira's face, saw the hope there, and something else, a challenge maybe, or an invitation, and he heard himself say, "All right, 30 days, I'll stay." The camp erupted in conversation, Apache voices rising and falling, debating this strange turn of events. But Neol simply nodded, as if Jack had passed some test he hadn't known he was taking. "Good," the war chief said. "Then welcome to our band, Jack Thornwood. For the next moon cycle, you are one of us. Try not to get yourself killed." It wasn't the most reassuring welcome Jack had ever received, but as he looked around the fire at the faces watching him, some suspicious, some curious, some openly hostile, he realized something strange. For the first time in 5 years, he didn't feel like he was drifting anymore. He felt like he'd been caught by a current and pulled towards something that might actually matter. The first week was hard, harder than Jack had anticipated, and he'd anticipated it being pretty damn difficult. The Apache didn't trust him. Not really. They tolerated him because Neol had commanded it and because Tahira vouched for him, but tolerance isn't the same as acceptance. The younger warriors, especially one named Chaska, who seemed to have a particular hatred for all white men, went out of their way to make things difficult. Tasks that should have been simple became complicated. Jack would be told to help with one thing, then be told he was doing it wrong and should do something else instead. He'd be given instructions in Apache and then mocked when he didn't understand. He'd find his bedroll moved, his supplies accidentally kicked over, his horse unhobbled and wandered away. It was testing, constant, relentless testing to see if he'd break, if he'd lose his temper, if he'd prove himself to be what they suspected, just another white man who couldn't be trusted. Jack endured it because what else could he do? He helped the women process hides, work that left his hands raw and bleeding until they calloused over. He gathered firewood, hauled water, dug fire pits, repaired wiki-ups. He did whatever grunt work needed doing without complaint, without argument, accepting the lowest position in the camp hierarchy, because he understood that was where he belonged. At night, he slept at the edge of camp. Not quite exile, but not quite included either. A liminal space that matched his status, present but not part of things. Tahira checked on him periodically, brought him food when the communal meals seemed to forget he existed, taught him basic Apache phrases, explained customs he was violating without knowing it. But she kept her distance otherwise, and Jack understood why. She was the chief's daughter, the heir apparent. She couldn't be seen as too friendly with the white stranger, not until he'd proven himself. If he proved himself, the breakthrough came on the 8th day, and it came because of horses. The Apache had a herd of maybe 20 horses, their most valuable possession, the difference between mobility and being trapped, between escape and capture. They were guarded constantly, rotated through the best grazing, treated with a respect that bordered on reverence. Jack was watching them one evening, leaning against a rock outcropping at the edge of camp, when he noticed one of the mares limping. Subtle, barely noticeable, unless you knew what to look for. But Jack had grown up around horses, had worked as a ranch hand and a wrangler, and he could read equine body language the way some people read books. That mare had something wrong with her front left hoof. He approached slowly, aware that the horses were as suspicious of him as their human owners were. But horses don't hold grudges the way people do, don't care about the color of your skin or what tribe you belong to. They care about whether you're calm, whether you're confident, whether you know what you're doing. Jack knew what he was doing. He reached the mare, ran his hand along her neck, spoke to her in the low, soothing tone that horses respond to. She tensed, then relaxed, let him approach, trusted him. He lifted her hoof carefully, and there it was, a stone wedged deep in the frog of her hoof, already causing inflammation. Left untreated, it would lead to an abscess, then to permanent lameness, then to having to kill a valuable animal. Jack used his knife to carefully extract the stone, cleaned the hoof, checked for other problems. The mare stood patiently through the whole process. And when he set her hoof down and patted her shoulder, she nickered softly. Thanks in horse language. Where did you learn to do that? Jack turned and found Chaska standing a few feet away, watching with an expression that was no longer quite as hostile, still suspicious, but now mixed with something that might have been respect. Grew up on a ranch in Texas, Jack said. Before I left, horses were the first language I ever learned. Chaska moved closer, examining the mare himself, ran his hand over the same spots Jack had checked, lifted the hoof, and looked at where the stone had been. Then he nodded slowly, and when he spoke, his English was halting but clear. This mare is sacred to my mother. If she had gone lame, it would have broken her heart. You saved this horse. Maybe you are not useless white man after all. It wasn't exactly a ringing endorsement, but it was the first acknowledgement Jack had received that he might be something other than a burden. Word spread quickly through the camp, the way news always spreads in small communities. By the next morning, Jack found himself approached by one of the older men, a warrior named Masca, who'd lost an arm in a fight with Mexican soldiers years ago, but still commanded immense respect. Masca brought him 3 more horses, each with minor problems that Jack diagnosed and treated. A thrown shoe that needed resetting, a cut that needed cleaning and binding, signs of colic in a young gelding that Jack caught early enough to treat with herbs and massage. By the end of that day, Jack had become the unofficial horsekeeper of the band, a position that came with actual status, actual respect. Horses were too valuable to trust to just anyone, and if Jack could keep them healthy, then he was valuable too. The dynamic shifted after that, not completely but noticeably. People nodded when they passed him, offered him food at meals without being prompted, stopped accidentally messing with his belongings. He was still an outsider, still white, still suspect, but he was also useful, and useful was a language everyone understood. Tahira found him 2 weeks into his stay, working on a particularly stubborn stallion who'd developed a fear of having his hooves handled. Jack was patient, systematic, rewarding tiny increments of progress with soft words and gentle touches, slowly teaching the horse that human hands didn't mean pain. "You're good at this," Tahira observed, settling onto a rock to watch. "It's just patience," Jack said. An understanding that fear isn't the same as aggression. This horse isn't mean, he's scared. Someone hurt him once and he remembers. You can't beat fear out of an animal. You have to replace it with something better. My father says the same thing about people, Tahira said quietly. He says the white men who run the reservations don't understand this. They think if they punish us enough, we'll forget who we are. But all they're doing is making us afraid, and fear makes people dangerous. Jack paused in his work, understood that they'd shifted from talking about horses to talking about something much larger. Is that why you're not on the reservation? Your father's band? We tried, Tahira said, her voice hard. For 2 years after the wars, we tried. We went to the place they told us to go. We stood in lines for food that never came. We watched children starve while the reservation agent grew fat. We watched our men, warriors who'd fought for their land, become beggars in their own country, and then... She stopped, her jaw tight. Then, Jack prompted gently, then they tried to take our children, send them to boarding schools where they would cut their hair, forbid our language, beat them for being Apache. My father said no. We left in the night, and we've been running ever since. Jack had heard stories about the Indian boarding schools, the government's attempt to civilize native children by erasing everything that made them who they were. He'd always felt vaguely uncomfortable about it, but he'd never really considered what it meant from the other side, what it would feel like to have someone try to steal your children's souls. I'm sorry, he said. For what it's worth. It's worth very little, Tahira said bluntly. Sorry doesn't feed hungry children or bring back the ones we've lost. But I appreciate the sentiment. Most white men don't even pretend to care. They sat in silence for a while. Jack working on the stallion, Tahira watching the sun descend toward the horizon. Finally, she spoke again. My father is impressed with you. He won't say it directly, but I can tell. You haven't complained, haven't tried to run, haven't demanded special treatment, and you've made yourself useful instead of being a burden. These things matter. I'm just trying to earn my keep, Jack said. You're doing more than that. Tahira stood, brushing dust from her buckskin leggings. In 3 days, there's a hunt. My father wants you to come. If you prove yourself there, you'll have truly earned a place among us. Not as a guest anymore, as one of the band. Jack felt something twist in his chest, part hope, part fear, part something he couldn't name. I'll do my best. I know you will, Tahira said, and then, surprising him, she smiled, a real smile, warm and genuine. You're starting to understand, Jack Thornwood. The river didn't just save my life. It brought you to yours. She walked away before he could respond, leaving Jack alone with the horses and his thoughts, wondering if she was right. Wondering if a man who'd spent 5 years running from his past could actually find a future among people who weren't even supposed to be his friends. The hunt was everything, a test of skill, endurance, courage, and the ability to work as part of a coordinated team. Jack understood this the moment Niall explained the plan. They were tracking a small herd of elk that had been spotted in the high country, dangerous terrain where one wrong step could mean a fatal fall. There were 8 hunters in total, Niall, Kele, Chaska, Maska despite his missing arm, 3 other warriors Jack had barely spoken to, and Jack himself. They left before dawn, moving through the darkness with a sureness that made Jack feel clumsy by comparison. But he kept up. His legs burned, his lungs ached in the thin mountain air, his city boy muscles screamed at him to stop, but he kept up. They tracked the elk for hours, reading signs that Jack could barely see, communicating in hand signals and glances that spoke of years of hunting together. Jack stayed quiet, watched, learned. When they paused to rest, he rested. When they moved, he moved. He didn't try to lead, didn't try to prove anything, just worked to be competent, useful, not a liability. It was mid-afternoon when they finally spotted the herd. 5 elk grazing in a small meadow surrounded by dense trees. Neol signaled for positions, and the hunters spread out in a practiced pattern that would cut off the elk's escape routes. Jack was positioned on the eastern side, with Chaska, interestingly enough. The young warrior who'd hated him most was now his hunting partner. Jack wasn't sure if this was a test, a punishment, or something else entirely. They waited in absolute silence, Jack barely breathing, his rifle ready but not raised, watching for Neol's signal. The elk continued grazing, unaware they were surrounded by predators who'd hunted these mountains for generations. Then, Neol's call, a perfect imitation of an elk's alarm cry. The herd bolted, exactly as predicted, exactly toward the kill zone where 3 warriors waited with bows drawn. Arrows flew. 1 elk went down immediately, a clean shot to the heart. Another stumbled, wounded but running. The rest scattered into the forest. Chaska was already moving, following the wounded elk with the single-minded focus of someone who understood that letting an animal suffer was both cruel and wasteful. Jack followed, his rifle ready, knowing his role was support. The wounded elk was fast, desperation giving it speed despite the arrow in its side. It crashed through underbrush, leaped over fallen logs, headed for higher ground where the terrain got treacherous. Chaska pursued with reckless courage, and Jack struggled to keep pace. Then the elk did something unexpected. It turned, sensing its pursuer, and charged. Not at Chaska, at Jack. Maybe it saw him as the weaker threat. Maybe it was just panic and rage. Either way, 300 pounds of wounded animal came at Jack with lowered antlers and murder in its eyes. Jack had maybe 2 seconds to decide. Raise his rifle and shoot, or dodge and risk the elk escaping to die slowly somewhere in the wilderness. He raised his rifle, aimed carefully despite the adrenaline screaming in his veins, and fired. The shot was clean, straight through the elk's skull, dropping it instantly. 1 second it was charging, the next it was dead, its momentum carrying its body forward to collapse at Jack's feet. Chaska appeared beside him, breathing hard, and looked at the elk, then at Jack, then at the elk again. "Good shot," he said finally. His English was getting better. "Very good shot. Most white men would have missed, or run." "Most white men don't grow up hunting to survive," Jack said. "Back home, if you missed your shot, your family didn't eat that week." Chaska studied him with new eyes, and Jack realized that in this moment he'd communicated something fundamental. He wasn't some city boy playing at frontier life. He was someone who understood hunger, understood necessity, understood what it meant to live on the edge of survival. "Come," Chaska said. "We honor the animal, then we carry meat back to camp. You killed it, you get first choice of the parts." They performed a brief ceremony, words in Apache that Jack didn't understand but respected, an acknowledgement that they'd taken a life and were grateful for it. Then they butchered the elk with practiced efficiency, Chaska showing Jack the Apache way of preserving every usable part. By the time they returned to camp, Jack carrying a heavy pack of meat that made his shoulders scream, the sun was setting in spectacular fashion, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed impossible, too beautiful for a world this hard. The camp celebrated that night, not just for the successful hunt, but for something else. Jack could feel it in the way people looked at him now. The wariness was still there. Some things take more than one good hunt to overcome, but it was tempered with something that might have been acceptance. Neol called him over to the main fire after everyone had eaten. The war chief regarded him with those penetrating eyes, then spoke in English so everyone could understand. "Jack Thornwood, you have stayed with us for nearly a full moon cycle. You have worked without complaint. You have shown respect for our ways even when you don't understand them. You have proven yourself useful with horses, and today you proved yourself competent in the hunt. These things matter." He paused, and the entire camp went silent, waiting. Your 30 days are almost complete. Soon you will be free to leave if you choose, but I have seen something in you, something that makes me believe you are a man without a home, without a people. And so I offer you this choice." Neil stood tall and commanding in the firelight. "You may leave when your time is done, with our blessing and our gratitude. You will always be welcome at our fires, always be under our protection as one who saved my daughter's life. Or," he let the word hang, "you may stay, not as a guest, not as an outsider, but as one of us. You will never be Apache by blood, but you can be Apache by choice, by honor, by deed." The camp erupted in murmurs, some approving, some clearly skeptical. This was unprecedented, apparently, inviting a white man to actually join the band. Jack felt his throat tighten, felt something breaking loose in his chest that he'd kept locked away for 5 years, since he'd left Texas, since he'd lost everything, since he'd decided that being alone was safer than being part of something that could be taken away. His voice cracked. He cleared his throat, tried again. "I don't know what to say." "Say yes or say no," Neil replied. "But understand what you're choosing. If you stay, you are bound to us. Our enemies become your enemies. Our struggles become your struggles. The army that hunts us will hunt you too. You will be branded a renegade, a traitor to your own people. You will never be fully trusted by either world. It is not an easy path." "Nothing about my life has been easy," Jack said quietly. "And the path I was on, it wasn't leading anywhere except more drifting, more emptiness." He looked around the camp, at the faces watching him. Tahira, her expression hopeful. Chaska, surprisingly neutral. Kayleigh, still suspicious, but no longer hostile. The women who'd taught him to process hides. The children who'd stopped running away when he walked past. The horses who trusted him. This could be taken away too, he knew. The army could find them. They could be forced onto a reservation. People could die. He could die. Nothing was guaranteed. But at least it would mean something. At least he'd be part of something larger than his own solitary survival. "Yes," Jack heard himself say, "I'll stay. If you'll have me, I'll stay." The camp exploded in noise. Some cheering, some arguing, everyone having an opinion. But Neil raised his hand for silence, and when he spoke, his voice carried absolute authority. "Then it is decided. Jack Thornwood is now of our band. Not white, not Apache, but something in between. A bridge between worlds, brought to us by the river that tried to take my daughter. We will see if this is wisdom or folly. Time will tell." He placed his hand on Jack's shoulder, a gesture that was part blessing, part warning. "Welcome, Jack Thornwood. May you never regret this choice." That night, as Jack lay in his bedroll, no longer at the edge of camp but moved closer to the center, a physical representation of his new status, he stared up at the stars and wondered if he'd just made the best decision of his life or the worst. But for the first time in 5 years, he felt something other than emptiness. He felt purpose. He felt connection. He felt home. The river had taken him, pulled him under, tumbled him through chaos and uncertainty, and deposited him somewhere he'd never expected to be. Among people who weren't his by blood, but who'd become his by choice. And somehow, impossibly, that was enough. Years later, long after the band was finally forced onto the reservation, long after Neil died and Tahira became war chief in his place, long after Jack Thornwood became known by his Apache name, Tu, which meant water, in honor of how he'd come to them, the story would be told around fires. The story of the white cowboy who jumped into a raging river to save a drowning stranger. The story of the life debt that became a life choice. The story of the man who gave up everything he knew to belong to people who'd been taught not to trust him. Some versions of the story would be exaggerated, would say he'd killed 100 soldiers defending the band, that he'd become the greatest warrior the Apache had ever seen, that he'd performed miracles with horses and healing. But the truth was simpler and somehow more powerful. Jack Thornwood had been a drifter, lost, empty, running from a past he couldn't fix and toward a future he couldn't imagine. And one day he'd heard a cry for help, and instead of riding past, instead of protecting himself, instead of choosing the easy path of indifference, he'd chosen to ace-tea. That single choice, that moment of instinctive humanity, had changed 2 lives, then 3, then dozens, then generations. Because Tahira would live to lead her people through some of the hardest years they'd ever face, would negotiate treaties, would fight when fighting was necessary, would preserve their culture even when the world tried to erase it. And she would always say, in interviews, in tribal council, in the stories she told her own children, that she learned resilience from her father, learned courage from her people, but learned hope from a white cowboy who proved that the lines between us are never as solid as we believe them to be. That family isn't just blood. That belonging isn't just birth. That sometimes the most important thing we do is just show up when someone needs us, even when it's terrifying, even when it costs us everything, even when the outcome is completely unknown. Jack Thornwood jumped into a river to save a stranger, and in doing so, he saved himself. That's the story. That's the legend. That's the truth that survives long after the details fade and the facts get fuzzy and the people become myths. One person can change everything if they're willing to get wet. And so the legend of Jack Thornwood drifted into the current of time, a story of honor, redemption, and the river that bound 2 souls forever. If you enjoyed this tale, don't ride off just yet, partner. Hit that like button to keep the campfire burning, and tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? And when you're done, don't miss out on more Western legends just like this one. Check out these other stories waiting right here on the trail.